the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. When the Buddha left home to find the answer to the suffering of humanity, he went to two well-known meditation teachers. The first, Alara Kalama, taught him the first four meditative absorptions, the meditative absorptions of the form realm. The Buddha was an excellent student and learned very quickly. Soon his teacher told him to take over the teaching, because he was just as capable as the teacher himself. But the Buddha, who was still Prince Siddhartha Gautama at that time, refused and said that he had not achieved his goal yet, and left to study with Uddaka Ramaputta, his second teacher. Uddaka Ramaputta taught him the four formless absorptions, which are more refined and more concentrated than the first four absorptions of the form realm. Again he was an excellent student, and the teacher told him to take over all his disciples. Again the prince refused because he realized that even though he was able to go into the highest meditative absorption, when he came out of this meditation, the suffering situation was the same as before. Nothing much had changed. Since Uddaka Ramaputta said he could teach him nothing further, the prince knew that he now had to strike out on his own. He left the 5 ascetics who had been his friends. They didn't want to accompany him but preferred the safety and security of having an established teacher.
When the prince came to the Bodhi tree, in what today is Bodh Gaya in northern India, he made a resolution. He would sit there without moving and without getting up even if his flesh should rot from his bones. So he sat and used the meditation skills he had learned to go into deep concentration from the first to the 8th meditative absorption, and back down again. While he was sitting there he was beset by Mara, temptation, which he successfully resisted. As his mind was totally calm and concentrated, not a ripple, not a movement, it was possible for him to gain the deepest insight. When he came out of this deep absorption, he could see the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path as an inner reality that left no residue. After he had done so, he realized he had become the Buddha, the fully enlightened one.
He sat in the bliss of liberation, offering great gratitude to the Bodhi tree, which had sheltered him. He stayed there for a month, but upon the pleas of the highest God, Brahma Sahampati, he decided that he would teach. At first, he thought that his teaching would be too profound, too difficult to understand. Trying to impart it to people, he would be vexed by their lack of comprehension. But he relented and agreed to teach for the benefit of humans and gods. First, he wanted to help his own teachers. When he tried to find them with his clairvoyant vision, he saw they had already died. Then he decided to teach his friends in the holy life, the 5 ascetics, who had studied with him. He looked to see where they were and found them near Benares. He decided to go and meet them there.
He walked the whole way. During his 45 years of teaching ministry, he walked everywhere. He never took a vehicle, because in those days vehicles were pulled by animals, and he would not burden an animal with his weight. Therefore, it is one of the rules for monks and nuns not to use an animal-drawn vehicle. We are lucky today, having other kinds of vehicles. The Buddha always walked. He taught every day. That's why such a wealth of material is available to us. In the original texts there exist over 17,500 discourses. When he neared Benares, the 5 ascetics saw him coming. They said to each other, "Look who's coming. Master Gautama. He has deserted the spiritual life. He's no longer an ascetic. He's well-fed, clean-shaven. We're not even going to greet him when he comes near." But their resolution was soon discarded, because when he came nearer they were overwhelmed by the majesty of his bearing and the radiance of his face. They greeted him very politely.
Then the Buddha told them, "I have become the Buddha, and I will teach you my doctrine." They were surprised and replied, "But how will we know that this is truly so?" "How can we tell?" he said. "You've known me for 6 years. Have I ever deceived you?" They said, "No." The Buddha then said, "Give me a hearing." They agreed to do that. In other words, they gave him the benefit of the doubt. They prepared a seat for him in the deer park of Isapatana outside Benares, and there they stayed for a week. Every day one of them went out for almsfood. The Buddha then proceeded to proclaim his very first discourse after his enlightenment, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma discourse. He started to turn the wheel of the Dhamma with that discourse, and it's still turning today, which is very fortunate for us. There are times in the world's cycles when there is no Dhamma, and it is often endangered. There have been times during this Dhamma period when, for instance, there wasn't a single monk here in Sri Lanka. The Dhamma is always in danger of disappearing because it goes against the grain of human instinct. It goes against the stream, against the current.
As the Buddha came to the end of his Dhamma discourse, one of his listeners became enlightened. The Buddha said, Anakandano sees, Anakandano knows, seeing and knowing. It is not enough to know. Seeing means the inner vision, the inner reality, which changes one's whole outlook and attitudes. Anakandano was the first arahant and also the first Buddhist monk. The Buddha is also called an arahant. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. He is an arahant, but he is also the Buddha. The difference being that the Buddha found the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path by himself without any teacher, whereas the arahant became enlightened by following the Buddha. When the Buddha's teaching is no longer in existence, then after many eons a new Buddha arises finding exactly the same Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path by himself. The Buddha is one who is able to expound the Dhamma. This is said to be a rare gift. There are those who are called Paksabuddha. They are enlightened, but they do not have the gift of teaching.
When one reads the discourses, one is amazed how often the Buddha repeats exactly the same words. Although it sounds very melodious in Pali, it is extremely repetitive and one wonders why. But it's not surprising. The spoken word is often repetitive. Not only that, but the Buddha realized the difficulty of penetrating to a profound truth by listening and therefore emphasized through repetition.
The Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths start out with the noble truth of suffering. The 5 friends to whom he was speaking had been ascetics for 6 years, mortifying their bodies. The Buddha had done the same, but had found this didn't bring enlightenment. Neither had indulgence, which he experienced in his princely life in the palace, brought happiness. He realized now that there was only one way, the middle path. There are no extremes one can use to advantage. These ascetics had used mortification of the body for some time. They knew all about the suffering of the body. The Buddha didn't have to emphasize it very much. They could see it easily.
For us it's not quite so easy. Although we do feel the suffering of the body in the meditation practice, we are well aware of the fact that once we go home we are not going to have it to the same extent. This then is temporary suffering, and because it has a very definite limit we can cope with it. We're not so sure yet that this body not only has suffering but is suffering. In fact, one can say that having this body is suffering. Just being burdened with a body of this kind is suffering. That doesn't mean that we are constantly beset by tragedy. Tragedy is one thing, the truth of suffering is another. The Buddha said, birth is suffering, decay is suffering, death is suffering. Not getting what one wants is suffering.
These are the main aspects, but then there are the others that arise between birth, decay, disease, and death. We obviously have our good days when we aren't aware there is suffering in us. We may be sorry for someone who is suffering at the time, but we're also glad that we're not experiencing it, forgetting that suffering is there all the time. It exists even in pleasure because we can't make pleasure last. Pleasure vanishes just when we want to catch hold of it. Every time we want to keep it, it disappears, and we have to find it again.
This body of ours cannot even sustain life unless it is constantly fed, cleaned, exercised, and repaired. All sorts of repairs are necessary: glasses, teeth, hearing aids, tonics, vitamins, cough syrup, shampoos, powders, and lotions. Millions of dollars are spent just to keep the body going, not even to improve it. One can't make it any younger even though many people try. All this effort, energy, money, and time is expended just to keep the body functioning. Unless we do expend this effort, the body will completely disintegrate. We might not even be able to use it anymore. Its inherent nature of not listening to our pleas for youth, health, beauty, long life, but doing exactly the opposite, can certainly be regarded as suffering.
The greatest suffering of the body is its many demands, which most people spend all their lives trying to satisfy. All the money people make, all the work they do, is to keep the body intact and satisfied. They have to work to get food, a house, clothing, and medicine. We wouldn't need any of that if we didn't have a body. Most people spend a lot of time trying to get a little more comfort and satisfaction for the body. That seems to be the greatest suffering, to spend one's life in this manner. The body is not the only sufferer. The mind is too, and haven't we noticed that? It won't listen, will it? It does what it pleases, instead of staying right where we want it. It continues to think about things that have a tendency to make us unhappy. If that isn't suffering, what is? It's also foolishness. But that too is suffering, isn't it?
The mind flits from one thought to another. The thinking process as such is suffering. Even wholesome and skillful thoughts have an inherent disquiet in them. When there is thinking of any kind, there cannot be any real calm. The mind with its thinking and the body with its many parts are both suffering. The Buddha said there is only one cause, one reason we experience suffering, and that's craving. We have 3 cravings and all others are connected with them. These 3 are craving for existence, craving for self-annihilation, and craving for sensual gratification. With these 3 cravings we are obviously enmeshed in suffering because all 3 are impossible to fulfill. There's no way we can win. We are engaged in a hopeless struggle, and that is real suffering.
We are engaged in the struggle for existence, and yet none of us is going to exist after our time has run out. We're also engaged in the struggle for sensual gratification, and that too is hopeless because it is momentary. It can't last. The third one, the desire for self-annihilation, is the opposite of the desire for existence and arises when things look too bleak. It also can't be fulfilled because non-existence is an impossibility except for the enlightened ones who perceive that nobody exists. The first and second noble truths show us that we are living a life of futility. No matter how nice our thoughts are, they are also going to perish. If one sees quite clearly that our cravings cannot possibly be gratified, then comes the moment of trying to find the way out of this dilemma that confronts every human being. Nobody is exempt. Seeing this creates compassion in our hearts for everyone, no matter how nasty, how unlovable, or how stupid they are. There is no loophole, but there is a way out.
The way out leads inward. If we check, we can't find anything outside ourselves. Most people look for a solution out there somewhere, through better conditions, nicer people, less work, a little less suffering. If we can really see the futility of that, we won't look out there anymore. Instead we'll look inside, and that will eventually lead to the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, which is liberation. The Buddha never really explained what liberation is. He did say what it is not. He knew it was not useful to explain it, because nobody who hadn't experienced it would understand. It was possible to say what liberation was not because at least people wouldn't then look in the wrong direction.
The following story illustrates this. Once there were a fish and a turtle who were friends. They had been living in the same lake together for some time. One day the turtle decided to visit the land surrounding the lake. She had a good look around and came back to tell her friend the fish of the wonders she had seen. The fish was very interested and asked the turtle what it was like on land. The turtle answered that it was very beautiful. The fish then wanted to know whether it had been transparent, cool, rippling, shiny, smooth, good for gliding, buoyant, and wet. When the turtle said it had none of these attributes, the fish said, "What can be beautiful about it then?"
The Noble Eightfold Path. The way to the cessation of all suffering, which is liberation or freedom, is the fourth noble truth, the Noble Eightfold Path. This path, like all of the Buddha's teachings, is divided into 3 parts: moral conduct, concentration, and wisdom. People often think that it has to go in that order, as if it were a ladder where the lowest rung of moral conduct makes it possible to get some concentration, which itself leads to insight and then wisdom. The Noble Eightfold Path proves this incorrect. It doesn't start out with moral conduct. It starts out with wisdom. The Noble Eightfold Path has to be looked upon not as a ladder, but as an 8-lane highway on which one has to use all lanes. It's also a circular movement because it starts out and ends with right view. Although right view is only mentioned at the beginning, The result of treading the Noble Eightfold Path will be absolute right view.
Right view. Right view is the first step because it means that one has seen clearly that there is nothing else to be done in one's life except to find the way out of suffering through a spiritual discipline. Then one is obviously going to look for the right kind of discipline, which needs to expound what is wrong with us. Our problems are suffering, dissatisfaction, anxiety, a feeling of not being fulfilled. There is an empty spot in the heart that one constantly tries to fill with a person or several persons, an idea, a project, a hope. Nothing will fill it. When a discipline is able to expound the basic dissatisfaction that we have and also explain the way to eliminate that dissatisfaction and come to total contentment, one can judge that this is a reliable teaching. The teaching must also go into the complete depth of human experience. The Buddha's Dhamma is such a teaching.
Right view includes the realization that it is possible for every one of us to actually start practicing. Right view also means having an understanding of Khema, namely taking full responsibility for what happens to oneself, not blaming others, or circumstances, or anything outside oneself. It means taking full responsibility for what one is and where one finds oneself, and realizing that one is master of one's own destiny. One can change. Knowing that one can change is not enough, one also needs to change. These are two right views, the understanding of Khema and of the need to effect a change in oneself in order to get out of suffering. Not changing the world or its inhabitants or the people we happen to live with, but changing ourselves. We cannot eliminate problems, but we can eliminate our own reactions. We can also eventually come to the end of the path that culminates in the right view of self, namely non-self.
Wisdom is needed to begin one's spiritual discipline. Without having had the wisdom to know that something needed to be done, we would not have started our meditation practice. Human beings have this wonderful opportunity because of suffering. Instead of constantly resisting dissatisfaction, trying to sweep it under the carpet, or lament and grieve about it, and be pained by it, we should be grateful for it. It's our very best teacher. In fact, you might say it is our only teacher, but unfortunately not everybody learns from it.
There are several ways of reacting to suffering. The first and common way is to blame someone else. That's the easy way. Everybody plays that game and it's childish. The second way of reacting to pain and dissatisfaction is to become depressed and get bogged down by it, indulging in unhappiness. The third reaction is being sorry for oneself, having the idea that one has all the suffering in the world. Nobody else has anything comparable, which is obviously untrue. When one is feeling sorry for oneself, one also expects others to commiserate. It doesn't work. Nothing is learned. Nothing is gained. On the contrary, one becomes a burden to others. Another way of reacting to suffering is to grit one's teeth, suppress the emotions, and pretend it hasn't happened. That too doesn't work, because pretending never works.
There is a fifth method, and that is looking suffering squarely in the face and saying, "Aha! My old friend's here again. What am I supposed to learn this time?" That is right view. Then we have really understood why the human realm is the best realm for enlightenment. Suffering is our best teacher because it hangs on to us and keeps us in its grip until we have learned that particular lesson. Only then does suffering let go. If we haven't learned our lesson, we can be quite sure that the same lesson is going to come again, because life is nothing but an adult education class. If we don't pass the subjects, we just have to sit the examination again. Whatever lesson we have missed, we'll get it again. That's why we find ourselves reacting to similar situations in similar ways many times. However, a time does come
When we notice this, and the right view arises, I've got to do something about myself. I'm having the same problem over and over again. Right view is the essential foundation for entering into the spiritual path. Right view in the beginning doesn't apply to right view of self. That is the end of the path. It is basically concerned with the first two noble truths. When we see clearly that we are fighting a losing battle, so long as we keep trying to have sense pleasures and protect ourselves from losing our ego, then we're on the way. That's the moment of entering the path, and it's a moment of joy. With it, a certainty arises that the way out has been found and that the final result must come. It's just a matter of time. That joyous feeling is essential for meditation, and meditation is essential for treading the path. Each one of us proves the Buddha's words. We have suffering and we have craving, we have